For a decade, I managed every route in your dad's aviation business. Now you're letting me go because your girlfriend handles operations. I asked the boss's son. Pack your desk today, he demanded. I gave him my ID card. You have 30 minutes before the entire fleet stops flying. Send your father my regards. For a decade, I managed every route in your dad's aviation business, I said, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. Now you're letting me go because your girlfriend handles operations. Preston Morrison stood across the conference table from me, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his face flushed with anger and something that looked almost like panic. Sienna sat beside him, clutching her rose-gold iPad like a shield, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the case. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button if you believe expertise and loyalty should be valued over empty credentials. It's free and helps us reach others who've been underestimated. Now let's see what happened next. Pack your desk today, Preston demanded, trying to sound authoritative but mostly sounding like a child throwing a tantrum. Security will escort you out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my ID badge, the one I'd carried for 10 years, the plastic worn smooth from a decade of swiping in and out of the server room that had become more home than my actual apartment. I looked at my photo from 2014, back when I still had hope in my eyes, back when I believed loyalty and expertise mattered. Then I placed it on the conference table between us. It landed with a small final click. You have 30 minutes before the entire fleet stops flying, I said calmly, checking my watch. It was 2:04 p.m., send your father my regards. That's when Preston's smile finally died. My name is Cassandra Hayes, and this is the story of how I brought down a regional airline without breaking a single law, just by walking out the door. But to understand how we got to that conference room, to that moment, to those 30 minutes that would destroy everything Preston's father had built, you need to understand what I was. What I'd become over 10 years of sacrifice that nobody saw, nobody valued, and nobody understood until it was far too late. I was the invisible foundation of Morrison Aviation. And foundations, when removed, don't just leave a gap. They bring down everything built on top of them. 10 years earlier, I'd walked into a cramped server room in Newark that smelled like burnt circuit boards and desperation. I was 28, freshly unemployed after the tech startup I'd been working for imploded during the recession, and I was interviewing for a position I barely understood at a regional airline I'd never heard of. Gerald Morrison, the founder and CEO, had looked at my resume for maybe 30 seconds before asking me a single question. Can you build something from nothing? I'd said yes, mostly because I needed the job and would have said yes to almost anything. But Gerald had believed me. That belief became the foundation of everything that followed. Morrison Aviation back then was 12 planes operating out of a single hangar, routes that barely covered the eastern seaboard, and a routing system that consisted of spreadsheets, phone calls, and prayer. Gerald handed me a server that looked like it had survived a minor explosion, a budget that wouldn't cover a decent laptop, and complete autonomy to build whatever I thought the company needed. So I built Skynet. The name was my small joke, a reference to the murderous AI from the Terminator movies, but the system itself was no joke. It was a proprietary routing platform I coded from absolute scratch, designed specifically for Morrison Aviation's needs. Flight plans, fuel calculations, crew assignments, weather routing, maintenance scheduling, FAA compliance filing. Everything flowed through algorithms I wrote during endless nights when normal people were sleeping or living actual lives. I didn't just manage the system. I was the system. Every route optimization, every on-time departure, every logistical miracle that kept the fleet in the air flowed through code that existed only in my head and on servers that only I had full administrative access to. I'd built it that way deliberately, not out of paranoia or control issues, but because aviation operations are too complex, too dynamic, too dependent on human judgment to ever be fully automated. The system needed someone who understood not just the code, but the why behind every decision, every override, every exception to the rules. Over 10 years, Morrison Aviation grew from 12 planes to 47 aircraft operating across 18 hub cities. We expanded from the eastern seaboard to routes that stretched from Boston to Miami, Chicago to Phoenix. Our workforce grew from 80 people to over 300. Revenue increased by 400%. And through it all, Skynet evolved with us, adapting, learning, becoming more sophisticated with every challenge we faced. Nobody outside my server room understood this. They saw planes taking off on time, passengers making their connections, cargo arriving where it was supposed to. They thought it was normal, routine, the natural order of things. They had no idea that every single flight depended on systems I'd built, protocols I'd written, algorithms that existed nowhere else in the world. Except Gerald. Gerald understood. He was a Vietnam vet in his 70s, a man who'd started the company with a single Cessna and a dream that most people thought was insane. He'd built engines with his own hands, flown through storms that should have killed him, survived business downturns that destroyed bigger companies. He understood what it meant to be essential, to be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Gerald never questioned why I needed administrative access to every system in the building. Never asked why I worked 70-hour weeks, why I sometimes slept on the couch in my office during storm season, why I'd come in at 2 in the morning when a blizzard threatened to ground the fleet. He'd just appear in my doorway with coffee, sit quietly in the corner while I manually rerouted 43 flights around weather systems, and then nod and say, "You're the reason we're still flying, Cass." He paid me well, significantly better than I could have gotten anywhere else, and he protected my autonomy like it was sacred. When other executives suggested bringing in outside consultants to optimize operations, Gerald shut them down. When the CFO proposed outsourcing routing to a third-party service to cut costs, Gerald told him to find savings somewhere else. When board members questioned why so much depended on a single person, Gerald looked them in the eye and said, "Because that single person is worth more than all of you combined." He had a daughter once, Emily. She died in a car accident when she was 26, just a few years before Gerald hired me. I'd seen her photo on his desk, bright smile, dark hair, eyes that looked like they understood how the world worked. Sometimes I caught Gerald looking at me with this sad, proud expression that I couldn't quite read. I wondered if he saw Emily in me, if I was filling some gap in his life that had been empty since she died. We never talked about it. He never said. But there was an understanding between us, a bond built on mutual respect and the recognition that some people are built differently, that some people give everything to their work because their work is the only thing that makes sense. My life contracted around that server room over the years. It happened so gradually I barely noticed until it was complete. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, skipped breakfast because eating felt like wasted time, drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic with the check engine light that had been on for 6 months straight to the office before the sun was fully up. I logged into Skynet before most people had poured their first coffee. I stayed until the last crisis was resolved, which some days meant midnight, other days meant I never left at all. I gave up dating after Tom. He was a software engineer I'd met at a conference, smart and funny and patient for about 8 months before patience ran out. The breaking point came on his birthday when I canceled our dinner reservation because of a mechanical delay in Atlanta that was cascading into crew shortages across 3 time zones. He'd stood in my apartment, my empty, lifeless apartment with beige walls I'd never bothered to paint and furniture I'd assembled wrong from IKEA, and said, "It's like you're married to that job." I'd corrected him without thinking, "I'm not married to it. I'm a part of it. There's a difference." He left that night. I went back to work. I gave up hobbies, friendships, anything that required consistency or emotional presence. My apartment became just a place I slept when I slept at all. The refrigerator contained mostly expired yogurt and leftover Chinese food in containers I couldn't remember ordering. The walls stayed beige. The furniture stayed wrong. I was okay with it. Or at least I convinced myself I was. My coworkers were friendly but distant. They knew I was essential but also unknowable. The woman who lived in the server room and spoke in technical jargon they didn't try to understand. Marcus, our maintenance director, was probably my closest friend, and even that relationship was built entirely on work. We'd grab lunch sometimes from the deli down the street, sit in the break room talking about aircraft systems and staffing challenges, but never about life, never about who we were outside these walls. I was 38 years old and I had nothing outside Morrison Aviation. No family nearby. My parents had retired to Arizona, my sister lived in California with kids I barely knew. No relationship, no social life, no identity separate from the work I did. I'd traded everything for expertise, for being irreplaceable, for the satisfaction of knowing that I kept 300 people employed and thousands of passengers safe. And then Gerald had a stroke. It happened in April. Not fatal, thank God, but serious enough to land him in a rehabilitation center in Florida for at least 6 months, maybe longer. The news hit me like a physical blow. I found out from his assistant, who called me at 6 in the morning with a shaking voice. Cassandra, Gerald collapsed in his office last night. They took him to Newark Medical. His son is flying in. His son. Preston Morrison. The words felt like a warning I should have heeded. I'd met Preston exactly twice before. Once at a Christmas party where he'd shown up in designer jeans and left after 20 minutes. Once at a shareholder meeting where he'd spent the entire presentation on his phone. He was 34, perpetually tan, and had spent the last 6 years finding himself in Southeast Asia, which based on his Instagram meant beach clubs, cryptocurrency schemes, and a lot of motivational posts about manifesting abundance. The morning Preston walked into Morrison Aviation as acting CO, I knew everything was about to change. He arrived late, 9:30, which in our world might as well have been noon, wearing a three-piece suit that cost more than my monthly rent. His hair was styled in that deliberately messy way that takes effort to achieve. His smile was all veneers and entitlement. And on his arm, like an accessory he'd purchased to complete the outfit, was Sienna Blackwell. Sienna was 29, blonde in that expensive high-maintenance way, and had exactly zero aviation experience. I knew this because I'd looked her up immediately after Preston's announcement email, excited to introduce Sienna Blackwell as our new Director of Operational Excellence. Her LinkedIn showed she'd been a brand strategist for a kombucha company that went bankrupt after their bottles started exploding in stores. Before that, a social media influencer specializing in detox teas and sponsored wellness posts. She was going to be in charge of operations. The operations I'd built. The systems only I understood. I sat in my server room that morning watching the monitors display the complex dance of 47 aircraft across 18 cities, and felt the ground shift beneath me. Everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd become over 10 years was suddenly vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Preston and Sienna wanted to modernize, to streamline, to democratize the knowledge. They wanted transparency and collaboration and all the buzzwords that people use when they don't understand what they're actually managing. They wanted to make me replaceable. And 3 weeks later in that conference room they tried. That's when I placed my ID badge on the table and started the 30-minute countdown that would prove exactly what happens when you fire the foundation and expect the building to keep standing. They walked into my server room on a Tuesday morning without knocking, without asking, like they owned the place, which technically Preston did. I was in the middle of preventing a cascading delay situation in Denver. A storm system was forming over the Rockies, and I had 3 flights that needed immediate rerouting or we'd have passengers stranded for 8 hours with no hotel coverage. My fingers were flying across the keyboard, eyes locked on 3 monitors simultaneously, left screen showing weather patterns in real-time radar, center displaying fuel reserves and alternate airport capacities, right tracking crew availability and FAA filing windows. I had maybe 4 minutes to make decisions that would save the company $60,000 and prevent a customer service nightmare. That's when I heard Preston's voice, too loud for the small room, shattering my concentration like a hammer through glass. Cassandra. Just the woman we wanted to see. I didn't look up immediately. Couldn't. I was in the middle of filing an emergency route change with the FAA, and if I broke focus now I'd have to start the entire sequence over. I hit enter, watched the confirmation code flash green, then allowed myself to turn my chair around slowly. Preston stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, rocking on his heels like he was about to deliver a TED Talk. He wore a navy suit that probably cost $4,000, his hair styled in that deliberately messy way that takes 20 minutes to achieve. Beside him, Sienna clutched her rose gold iPad like a shield, her eyes scanning my workspace with barely concealed disgust. I watched her gaze move from the tangle of cables on the floor to the half-empty energy drink cans on my desk to the coffee stains on the industrial carpet that had been there since before I started. Preston, I said, my voice carrying the kind of exhausted patience you reserve for children who don't understand why they can't pet the wild animal. The door was locked for a reason. What can I do for you? We're doing a culture audit, Sienna announced, her voice bright and sharp like breaking glass. She stepped further into the room, wrinkling her nose slightly at the smell, burnt circuit boards, stale coffee, the metallic tang of electronics running too hot for too long. Preston and I feel like Morrison Aviation needs to evolve. Become more collaborative. More transparent. I looked at her for a long moment. Transparent. You want to make the routing algorithms transparent. We want to democratize the knowledge, Sienna said, like she was reading from a business self-help book she'd skimmed on a plane. Right now, too much institutional knowledge is siloed. If something happened to you. If something happened to me, I interrupted, the entire operation would collapse in about 90 minutes. That's not a threat, Preston. That's logistics. Preston's smile tightened. See, that's exactly the kind of mindset we need to shift. No one should be irreplaceable. That's not healthy for you or the company. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I turned back to my monitors where a new alert was already flashing. The Denver reroute had triggered a crew timing issue in Salt Lake City that needed immediate attention. Is there anything else? I'm kind of in the middle of keeping your planes in the air. We'll schedule a proper meeting, Preston said, and I could hear the edge in his voice, the barely controlled irritation of someone who wasn't used to being dismissed. This week, we need to discuss operational restructuring. They left. The door clicked shut, and I sat there staring at my screens, feeling something cold and certain settle in my stomach. This was how it would begin. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched Preston and Sienna systematically dismantle everything Gerald had built, decision by catastrophic decision. They started with Marcus. Marcus had been our maintenance director for 15 years. He was 53, built like a retired linebacker, and could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. I'd seen him walk past a plane on the tarmac, stop, tilt his head and say, "That's a failing compressor bearing in the number 2 engine." He was right. He was always right. Marcus had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars by catching issues before they became catastrophic, before they grounded planes or, worse, endangered lives. Preston fired him on a Wednesday and replaced him with a predictive maintenance app. Marcus called me that night. I was still at the office at 9 p.m., dealing with a fuel pricing anomaly that was throwing off our cost calculations. My phone buzzed. "Marcus." I answered. "They let me go, Cass." His voice was shaking, something between anger and disbelief. 23 years in aviation. 15 with Morrison. They gave me 2-week severance and a pamphlet about career transition services. "I'm so sorry, Marcus." I meant it. He was one of the few people in the company I actually respected, actually trusted. "That app they're using?" Marcus continued, his voice getting harder. "It grounded 2 planes today for sensor errors that don't exist. False positives. Meanwhile, it completely missed a hydraulic leak on the Atlanta shuttle that I flagged this morning. They ignored me. Said the app would catch it if it was real." He paused. "They're going to kill someone, Cass. You know that, right?" I knew. I'd seen the reports. I'd documented the hydraulic leak myself and sent it to Preston with a detailed explanation of why it needed immediate attention. His response had come back within minutes. "Thanks for the feedback, Cassandra. Let's trust the new systems and embrace the change journey." That emoji. That goddamn smiley face. It became the punctuation mark of my professional execution, appearing at the end of every dismissive email, every rejected recommendation, every warning I sent that was ignored. I started documenting everything. Not just the technical issues, but every conversation, every decision, every warning I gave that was brushed aside. I created a folder on my personal drive, not the company server, and filled it with emails, screenshots, incident reports, cost analyses showing exactly how much money each of Preston's decisions was hemorrhaging. I told myself I was building a case, creating evidence that even Preston couldn't ignore. But deep down I knew I was building a different kind of insurance. They eliminated the night dispatch team next. Preston announced it in a company-wide email with the subject line, "Operational Optimization." The night team consisted of 4 people who handled the cargo operation that ran from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., 30% of our revenue, mostly contracts with logistics companies and medical supply chains. Time-sensitive, high-value, zero-tolerance for delay cargo. "No one flies at midnight," Preston had argued in the meeting where I tried to stop this decision. "We're paying people to sit around doing nothing. We have 12 cargo flights every night," I'd explained, pulling up the schedule on my laptop and projecting it onto the conference room screen. Medical supplies, time-sensitive documents, overnight logistics contracts. That's not nothing. That's $9 million in annual revenue. Sienna had looked at the numbers and frowned. "Can't we just automate that? Have the system handle it?" "The system does handle the routine parts," I'd said, trying to keep my voice level. "But when there's weather or mechanical issues or crew problems at 3 in the morning, Someone needs to make decisions in real time. The automation handles the easy stuff. Humans handle the chaos. Preston had smiled that practiced, dismissive smile. I think we can manage. If issues come up, we'll address them then. The night team was gone by Friday. By Monday, we'd missed 2 critical cargo deadlines because a mechanical issue in Memphis went unnoticed for 6 hours. The client canceled their contract. That was $3 million in annual revenue gone. I sent Preston a detailed breakdown of the cost. He replied, "Learning curves are part of growth. Let's stay positive." Then Sienna started shadowing me. She appeared in my office one morning with her rose gold iPad and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Preston thought it would be great if I learned the operations side from you. You know, knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer. Like 10 years of expertise could be downloaded in a few casual observation sessions." She sat in the corner of my server room, scrolling through Instagram, occasionally looking up to ask questions that revealed a comprehension of aviation operations roughly equivalent to a golden retriever's understanding of quantum physics. "Why do we have so many different route codes?" she asked one afternoon, examining her manicured nails. "Couldn't we just number them 1 through 10? Make it simpler." I stared at her, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't get me fired on the spot. Because we have 47 aircraft operating across 18 hub cities with different fuel capacities, passenger loads, crew certifications and weather patterns. 1 through 10 wouldn't even cover the planes, much less the variables. She wrinkled her nose like I'd deliberately said something complicated just to confuse her. "That seems unnecessarily complex." "Aviation is complex, Sienna. That's why people train for years to do it." Another day she asked, "Why does the system need to talk to the FAA? Can't we just email them our flight plans?" I took a long breath, counting to 5 in my head. The FAA requires real-time flight plan filing with encrypted verification protocols. Email wouldn't meet federal requirements. We'd be grounded within an hour. She typed something on her iPad, not looking at me. "Have you considered using AI to make this more intuitive?" I almost laughed. "I am the AI, Sienna. I'm the artificial intelligence holding this together. I'm the machine learning from 10 years of experience. And I'm starting to predict that this company has about 3 weeks before catastrophic failure." She looked at me with those dead-behind-eyes influencer eyes. "You're so negative, Cassandra. Preston and I are building something beautiful here. You're either on the plane or you're not." The irony of her metaphor was completely lost on her. The office changed. The break room that used to be loud and chaotic. People trading war stories, making bets on arrival times, the constant hum of an operation that worked, went silent. It felt like a funeral parlor. Everyone walked on eggshells. Janet from HR started avoiding eye contact with everyone, disappearing into her office and closing the door. The remaining dispatch crew worked with grim determination, heads down, knowing their jobs hung by a thread. I went home every night to my empty apartment and microwaved something frozen that I barely tasted. I'd sit on my couch drinking cheap wine straight from the bottle, watching planes take off from Newark in the distance, their lights blinking against the darkening sky. I felt the weight of 300 jobs pressing on my shoulders. The pilots, the crew, the mechanics, the gate agents who had families and mortgages and lives that depended on Morrison Aviation staying airborne. I could quit. The thought came to me every night, whispered in the back of my mind like a temptation. I could walk away, let it collapse, find another job. But if I did, all those people would lose everything because Preston was too arrogant and Sienna was too incompetent to understand what they were destroying. So I stayed. I documented. I prepared reports with charts and data and highlighted sections showing exactly how each decision was creating cascading risks. I tried to build a case that even Preston couldn't ignore. But deep down, in that place where we know things before we're ready to admit them, I knew the truth. My time was running out. The question wasn't if they'd fire me. The question was when. And whether I'd see it coming in time to do anything about it. The calendar invite appeared on my screen at 9:47 a.m. on a Friday morning, exactly the kind of timing that corporations use for executions. Quick chat, Preston, Sienna, H at 2 p.m. No agenda. No context. No phone number for a call, which meant it would be in person. Just that professional equivalent of, "We need to talk," that makes your stomach drop and your mouth go dry. I stared at the notification for a full minute, my cursor hovering over the decline button even though I knew declining wouldn't change anything. My hands had stopped typing. On the center monitor, a weather alert was flashing for a storm system forming over the Carolinas, but I couldn't focus on it. The words on the screen blurred slightly. Quick chat. Nothing about work was ever a quick chat, especially not when HR was involved. I closed the notification and forced myself back to work, pulling up the routing interface to redirect a flight around the developing weather pattern. But my hands were shaking. Just slightly, just enough that I had to retype a command twice before getting it right. I'd been expecting this for weeks. Every firing, every dismissal, every restructuring decision had been building toward this moment. But seeing it actually scheduled made it real in a way that all my mental preparation hadn't. I looked around my server room. The flickering monitors casting blue light across walls that had never been painted. The tangle of cables snaking across the floor like veins. The half-dead succulent on my desk that I'd been keeping alive for 3 years, watering it sporadically when I remembered. A small living thing in a space otherwise dominated by machines. This was my kingdom, my creation, the place where I'd spent more hours than my own apartment. And they were about to exile me from it. I thought about calling Marcus, but he was already gone, already fired, already dealing with his own betrayal. What would I say anyway? That I was next. He already knew. Everyone knew. The only question had been when. Instead, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. If they were going to fire me, I was going to make absolutely certain they understood exactly what they were losing. I spent the next 4 hours preparing for my own obsolescence in a way I'd never allowed myself to consider before. I pulled up the Skynet architecture documentation, the real documentation, not the sanitized version that IT had access to, but my personal notes that mapped every dependency, every authentication pathway, every security protocol I'd built into the system over 10 years. Skynet wasn't just software I managed. It was software I'd architected with a very specific security feature that I'd never disclosed to anyone, not even Gerald. Every core function, every routing algorithm, every fuel optimization protocol, every crew assignment logic, ran through a master authentication node tied directly to my employee credentials. I'd designed it that way deliberately back in 2014 when I was building the first version. It was a security measure. If my account was ever compromised by a hacker or unauthorized access, the system would immediately lock down to prevent damage. But there was an unintended consequence I'd discovered 3 years ago during a routine security audit. If my credentials were deactivated, not compromised but actually terminated in the HR system, the authentication node would interpret it as a critical security breach. The system wouldn't just log me out. It would initiate a complete lockdown protocol, reverting all automated functions to manual override and purging temporary route caches to prevent potential data corruption. In plain English, if they fired me, every plane in the fleet would lose its digital flight plan within approximately 30 minutes of my credentials being terminated. I'd never mentioned this to anyone because I'd never needed to. Gerald trusted me. Gerald would never fire me. But Gerald wasn't here anymore, and his son was about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. I sat back in my chair, staring at the documentation, understanding with perfect clarity that this wasn't a bug in the system. It was my insurance policy. At 1:45 p.m. I began quietly cleaning out my desk. Not obviously, I didn't want to telegraph anything to the few remaining coworkers who might glance through my office window. But methodically, I transferred my personal photos to my phone. The one of my grandmother who'd raised me. The picture of me and my sister from 5 years ago, the last time we'd seen each other in person. I deleted my browsing history, cleared my personal bookmarks, logged out of my email on my phone. I backed up exactly nothing related to Morrison Aviation. No files, no code, no documentation. If they wanted my knowledge, they should have valued it while they had it. I packed the framed photo of my grandmother that had sat on my desk for 10 years. The glass cracked slightly in one corner from the time I'd knocked it over during a particularly stressful night. I packed the stress ball shaped like an airplane that Gerald had given me on my 5th anniversary, his way of acknowledging what I did without making a big deal of it. I watered my succulent one last time, knowing it would be dead within a week under anyone else's care. Then I sat in my chair and waited, watching the clock on my monitor count down the minutes. At 1:58 p.m. I stood up, smoothed down my shirt, the same polyester company polo I wore most days, wrinkled from being pulled out of a drawer that morning, and walked to the executive conference room. The one with the glass walls overlooking the tarmac, where you could watch planes taxi while your career was terminated. The symbolism felt almost poetic. I could see them through the glass before I opened the door. Preston sat at the head of the long table like a king on a throne, his posture carefully arranged to project authority he hadn't earned. Sienna was to his right, clutching her iPad against her chest like a shield. Janet from HR sat in the corner, her face pale, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I opened the door. All three of them looked up. "Cassandra, have a seat," Preston said, gesturing to a chair positioned noticeably lower than his. A power move I'd read about in the same business books he'd apparently skimmed during his years of finding himself. I remained standing. I prefer to stand. Bad back. Comes from carrying this company for a decade. Preston's jaw tightened. Sienna's nostrils flared. "Look, Cassandra," Preston started, his voice trying for gentle and landing somewhere around condescending. "We've been evaluating the organizational structure, and Sienna and I feel that your approach to operations is, how do we say this? Too traditional," Sienna interrupted, leaning forward with that earnest expression influencers use when they're about to say something they think is profound. "We need agility. We need someone who embraces innovation, who isn't stuck in legacy systems and territorial thinking. Someone who's a culture fit." I looked at her for a long moment. "Someone like you." "Exactly." Sienna beamed, completely missing the sarcasm dripping from my voice. "I've been studying operational frameworks for 3 weeks now, and I really think I can bring fresh energy to routing and logistics." I felt something inside me snap. Not anger exactly. Anger is hot, reactive, uncontrolled. This was different. This was cold, crystalline clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop fighting gravity and just let yourself fall. "For a decade, I managed every route in your dad's aviation business," I said slowly, deliberately, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "Now you're letting me go because your girlfriend handles operations?" Preston's face flushed red. He stood up, trying to reclaim whatever authority my words had just stripped from him. "This isn't about Sienna. This is about you refusing to adapt, refusing to collaborate, refusing to watch incompetence crash planes?" I interrupted. "Yeah, guilty." "Pack your desk today," Preston demanded, his voice rising. "Security will escort you out. We'll email the severance details. Sign the NDA and you'll get 4 weeks' pay." 4 weeks. 10 years of 80-hour weeks. 10 years of missed birthdays and holidays and relationships that died because I was always at work. 10 years of keeping his father's dream alive while Preston was getting high on beaches in Thailand and posting about manifestation. 4 weeks of severance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my ID badge. The magnetic strip was worn almost smooth from a decade of use. The plastic was cracked at the corner. My photo was from 2014, back when I still had hope in my eyes. Back when I believed that loyalty and expertise and hard work actually mattered to the people who benefited from it. I looked at that photo for a long moment. Then I placed the badge on the conference table between us. It landed with a small final click. "You have 30 minutes before the entire fleet stops flying," I said calmly, checking my watch. It was 2:04 p.m., "Send your father my regards." Preston laughed. Actually laughed like I'd just told a joke he didn't quite understand but felt obligated to acknowledge. "What are you talking about? We have full access to Skynet. IT confirmed it this morning. Everything's backed up on the cloud." "You have access to the interface," I said, meeting his eyes. "You don't have access to the authentication node. And in about 30 minutes, when HR deactivates my credentials in the system, Skynet is going to interpret that as a critical security breach and initiate emergency lockdown protocol." The smile slid off Preston's face like ice cream melting in July. "You're bluffing," Sienna said, but her voice wavered, uncertain now. "Am I?" "Coy. Ask them about master authentication dependencies. Ask them who holds the root credentials for the routing core." I picked up my bag from where I'd set it by the door. "Or don't. Either way, I'm not your problem anymore." "Wait," Preston started, reaching out like he might physically stop me. "Oh, one more thing," I said, pausing at the door, looking back at them one last time. "When the system locks down, it defaults to manual routing. That means someone will need to physically create flight plans for every single aircraft using paper charts and calculators. Last time that happened was 1987. Takes about 4 hours per plane. You have 47 aircraft. I looked directly at Sienna. Hope you're fast at math. I walked out. Behind me I heard Janet gasp. Heard Sienna's frantic voice asking Preston what I was talking about. Heard Preston fumbling for his phone. I didn't look back. I took the elevator down to the parking lot, got in my 12-year-old Honda Civic with the check engine light that would probably never get fixed, and drove exactly 2 miles to a diner called the Landing Strip. It was 2:24 p.m. when I slid into a booth by the window. I ordered coffee and cherry pie from a waitress who looked too tired to care why I was there in the middle of the afternoon on a Friday. And then I waited for the world to end. At 2:31 p.m., my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. Preston Morrison. I declined the call and set the phone face down on the diner table. The waitress had just brought my pie, cherry with a lattice crust that looked homemade, and I wasn't about to let Preston ruin it. The phone buzzed again. Sienna Blackwell. Declined. Janet from HR. Declined. A number I didn't recognize but assumed was IT. Declined. I took a bite of pie. The filling was perfect, not too sweet with just enough tartness to make my mouth water. I chased it with coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the burnt sludge from the office break room. Outside the diner window, I could see planes taking off from Newark in the distance, their wings catching the afternoon sunlight as they climbed into clear blue sky. My phone buzzed with a text. Marcus. Cass, what's happening? Systems are throwing errors I've never seen before. I stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone down without responding. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to understand in real time what it meant to lose the person who held everything together. I wanted Preston to sit in that conference room, surrounded by people who didn't know what they were doing, and slowly realize that his girlfriend's 3 weeks of studying operational frameworks hadn't prepared her for this. I took another bite of pie. At 2:47 p.m., Marcus sent another message. First alert just appeared on the operations board. Flight 2847 to Chicago showing route authentication error. Dispatchers are panicking. Preston's screaming at I. What did you do? I smiled into my coffee cup. What did I do? I hadn't done anything. I'd simply left. I'd walked out the door like they'd asked me to. The system was doing exactly what it was programmed to do, protecting itself from unauthorized access when the master credentials disappeared. I could picture it perfectly. The operations center with its wall of monitors, the dispatchers staring at screens that were suddenly displaying errors they'd never seen before. The IT team frantically checking connections, rebooting servers, searching through documentation they didn't understand. Preston standing in the middle of it all, his expensive suit wrinkled now, his carefully styled hair falling into his eyes, his voice getting higher and more panicked with every passing minute. At 2:51 p.m. the cascade accelerated. Marcus sent a rapid series of texts. Flight 1203 to Atlanta, authentication error. Flight 0956 to Dallas, authentication error. Flight 2334 to Minneapolis, same thing. Cass, it's spreading. Every flight is throwing errors. The authentication node is looking for something and can't find it. I sipped my coffee and watched the planes outside continue their normal operations. Delta, United, American, all flying perfectly fine. Only Morrison Aviation was falling apart. Because Morrison Aviation had fired the person who knew how to keep it flying. One by one, every plane in the system was throwing red flags as the authentication node searched for my credentials, found nothing and initiated lockdown protocols. It was beautiful in its own way. A perfect cascade of failure triggered by a single missing piece. Like removing a keystone from an arch and watching the entire structure collapse inward. At 2:53 p.m., Marcus's text came through in all capital letters. FAA just issued a ground stop. All Morrison aircraft grounded pending resolution. Cass, what is happening? The FAA ground stop. The nuclear option. The thing that happens when air traffic control decides an airline has lost control of its own operations and represents a safety risk. Planes already in the air would be diverted to alternate airports. Planes on the ground would stay there, frozen at their gates, passengers trapped inside, pilots unable to access updated flight plans or departure clearances. I could imagine the chaos. Dispatchers trying manual overrides, typing in backup codes that didn't work because there were no backup codes. I was the backup system. IT trying to reboot Skynet entirely, watching it come back online, search for my credentials, find nothing, and immediately lock down again. A perfect feedback loop. An elegant spiral of failure that I'd neither created nor prevented. I'd simply removed myself from the equation and the equation had collapsed. My phone started ringing again. Preston. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, putting it on speaker and setting it on the table next to my half-eaten pie. Fix this. Preston's voice exploded from the speaker, high-pitched and cracking with panic and rage. I don't know what you did, but you need to fix this right now. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch between us. The old man at the other end of the diner glanced over, then went back to his newspaper. The waitress refilled my cup without comment. I didn't do anything, Preston, I said finally, my voice calm and measured. You fired me, remember? Pack your desk today, you said. So I did exactly what you asked. I packed my desk. I turned in my badge. I left. The system did exactly what it was programmed to do. You sabotaged us. He was practically sobbing now. In the background I could hear Sienna crying, someone yelling about the FA, phones ringing off the hook. The operations center must have been complete pandemonium. You did something to the system before you left. I protected intellectual property. I corrected him, keeping my voice steady. Check the security protocols you never bothered to read. Section 7.3. Master authentication nodes shall terminate upon credential deactivation to prevent unauthorized system access. It's right there in the documentation I filed with IT 6 years ago. Would you like me to email you a copy? There was a long, horrible silence on the other end. I could hear Preston's breathing, fast and shallow. Someone in the background was saying something about calling lawyers. What do you want? Preston's voice had changed now, desperation replacing anger. Money? I'll triple your salary. I'll give you equity. I'll give you whatever you want. Just come back and fix this. I felt a strange hollowness in my chest. I'd expected this moment to feel triumphant, satisfying, like justice finally being served. Instead it just felt empty. Necessary but empty. It's not about money, Preston, I said. It's about watching everything your father built burn down because you trusted your girlfriend over a decade of expertise. It's about you learning what happens when you treat your foundation like it's disposable. My father, Preston whispered, and for the first time he sounded less like a trust fund tyrant and more like a scared little boy who'd just realized he'd broken something he couldn't fix. You're doing this to hurt my father. That stung. More than I wanted to admit. Your father trusted me to protect his company, I said quietly. He paid me well. He respected my expertise. He understood that some people aren't just employees, they're infrastructure. You're the one who fired that protection. Now you get to explain to him why his life's work is parked on the tarmac losing $53,000 per hour. I hung up before he could respond. The diner was nearly empty now. Just me, the waitress wiping down tables, and the old man with his newspaper. Through the window, I watched planes from other airlines continue their normal operations. Takeoffs and landings, the constant rhythm of an industry that worked because people valued expertise and didn't fire the people who kept them in the air. Only Morrison Aviation was grounded. Only Morrison Aviation was hemorrhaging money and reputation with every passing minute. I finished my pie and ordered another cup of coffee. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Marcus. Updates delivered like war correspondents from the front lines. Every dispatcher is calling their own contacts trying to get information. IT says it'll take days to rebuild the authentication system from scratch. Preston just threw a chair. Security had to escort him out of the operations center. Sienna locked herself in the bathroom. Someone heard her on the phone with her mom. By 4 p.m., Morrison Aviation had canceled every flight for the next 72 hours. There was no choice. Without functioning routing systems, they couldn't file flight plans. Without flight plans, the FAA wouldn't clear them to fly. Without clearance, 47 aircraft sat useless. By 6 p.m., the story had hit the news. I watched it on my phone while sitting in my car in the diner parking lot. Footage of angry passengers at 5 different airports. Interviews with stranded travelers holding tickets they'd paid for, hotels they'd have to book, meetings they'd miss. A spokesman from Morrison Aviation reading a prepared statement about unexpected technical difficulties and working around the clock to resolve the issue. The news anchors were speculating. Cyber system failure. Sabotage. They had no idea how close to the truth that last one was. By 8 p.m. I was back in my apartment, sitting on my balcony with a glass of cheap wine, when my phone buzzed with a news alert that made my stomach drop. Breaking. Gerald Morrison leaves Florida rehab facility against medical advice, returns to Newark to address company crisis. I clicked the article. There was a photo of Gerald being helped into a private medical transport, his face gray, his body hunched, an oxygen tube visible under his nose. The old man was coming home to save his dying company, still recovering from a stroke, because his son had destroyed it in less than 2 months. I felt a pang of guilt then. Not for Preston. Not for Sienna. But for Gerald. He'd built something beautiful. Something that mattered. Something that employed 300 people and connected cities and kept the economy moving. And I just watched it collapse. But even as the guilt twisted in my chest, I reminded myself of the truth. I didn't collapse it. I was the only thing holding it together. They'd fired the foundation and were now shocked that the building was falling. That wasn't my fault. That was gravity. Saturday morning, I woke up at 10 a.m. for the first time in a decade. No alarm blaring in the darkness. No emergency calls pulling me out of sleep. No weather systems forming over the Midwest that needed immediate routing adjustments. Just silence and sunlight filtering through my bedroom curtains in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I lay there for a moment, disoriented by the quiet, before reaching for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up with notifications that had accumulated overnight like snow during a blizzard. 43 missed calls. 67 unread emails. Dozens of text messages. I scrolled through them with a strange detachment. Preston had called 9 times. 6. Numbers I didn't recognize. Probably reporters, based on the voicemails asking for comment about the Morrison aviation crisis. Janet from HR had sent an email with the subject line urgent. Legal matter, that I deleted without reading. But one voicemail made my hands shake when I saw the number. Gerald Morrison. I sat up in bed, staring at the notification. Part of me wanted to delete it without listening, to cut that final thread connecting me to the wreckage I'd left behind. But something stopped me. Maybe curiosity. Maybe guilt. Maybe the part of me that still remembered the old man who'd believed in me when I was 28 and desperate. I pressed play and put the phone to my ear. Cassandra, it's Gerald. His voice was weak, raspy, so much older than I remembered. The stroke had changed him. Preston told me what happened. Not his version. I called Marcus, I called Janet, I called the IT director. I know what really happened. There was a long pause, the sound of labored breathing. I'm so sorry, kid. I should never have left him in charge. I should have made provisions. I should have protected you. Another pause. I know I don't have the right to ask, but the company. 300 jobs. Will you help me save it? The message ended. I listened to it again. And then a third time. The first time I heard desperation. An old man watching his life's work crumble and reaching out to the only person who could stop it. The second time I heard genuine remorse. The sound of someone who understood they'd made a terrible mistake and was facing the consequences. The third time I heard something deeper. A father who'd lost his daughter years ago and was now losing his son's respect, his company, everything he'd built with his own hands. I sat on my balcony with coffee I'd made from actual beans, not the burnt office sludge, and watched planes from other airlines fly overhead. Delta, United, American. All operating normally while Morrison Aviation sat grounded. The fixer in me, the part that had spent 10 years solving impossible problems at 2 in the morning, screamed to call Gerald back and say yes. To walk back into that server room and restore the systems and save 300 jobs and prove that I was the only one who could do it. But the woman who'd been offered 4 weeks severance for a decade of loyalty had a different answer. I picked up my phone and called Gerald back. He answered on the first ring, breathing hard like he'd been sitting by the phone waiting. Cassandra, thank God. Look, whatever you need, name your price, name your terms. Full equity. CEO position. Complete operational control. Just please help me save this. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 300 jobs pressing down on my shoulders. The pilots with families. The gate agents with mortgages. The mechanics with kids in college. All of them counting on Morrison Aviation to keep flying, to keep paying their salaries, to keep existing. Mr. Morrison, I can't come back, I said quietly. Whatever you want, Cassandra. I'll give you anything. If I come back and fix this, I interrupted. I'm admitting I sabotaged the system. And we both know that's not true. Your son made a personnel decision without understanding the technical consequences. That's on him, not me. Silence on the other end. Then, in a voice that sounded broken, then what do I do? How do I fix this? I took a breath. There are no easy fixes. But I'll give you a gift because I still respect what you built, even if your son tried to destroy it. Anything. Tell me. In your office, bottom drawer of the credenza behind your desk, there's an envelope marked System Recovery Protocol. I paused, remembering the night 5 years ago when I'd written those instructions, imagining scenarios where I might die suddenly and leave the company stranded. I wrote it in case something ever happened to me. Accident, illness, whatever. Follow those instructions exactly. It'll take your IT team about 96 hours to rebuild the authentication architecture from scratch. You'll be flying again by Wednesday. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. You planned for this. You knew this could happen. I planned for my death, Gerald. I didn't plan for your son to be an idiot. But the protocol will work either way, assuming your IT team can follow directions without screwing it up. I heard him exhale, something between a laugh and a sob. What else? What else do I need to do? This was the moment that would define everything. I could be generous, diplomatic, professional. Or I could tell him the hard truth that nobody else would. I chose truth. Fire Preston, I said. Immediately. Today. Don't give him a transition period. Don't let him save face. Fire him and Sienna both and make it clear to everyone, publicly, that they're the reason this happened. Cassandra. Put Marcus back in charge of operations. He's the only one left who actually understands aviation. And if you ever let someone who thinks synergy is a strategy anywhere near your company again, you deserve what happens next. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. He's my son, Cassandra. He's your son, I agreed. But he's also the reason 300 people might lose their jobs. He's the reason your company is about to declare bankruptcy. He's the reason your life's work is circling the drain. I paused. You have to choose, Gerald. Family or legacy. You can't save both. The silence stretched between us, heavy with calculations I couldn't see but could imagine. The math of love versus responsibility. Blood versus competence. The son he'd raised versus the company he'd built. Okay, Gerald finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hey, I'll do it. I'll fire him. Another pause. Then, but Cassandra, will you ever forgive me? For not protecting you, for not seeing this coming. I felt tears prick my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, watching a plane climb into the clear morning sky. I don't know, Mr. Morrison, I said honestly. Ask me again in a year. I hung up before he could respond. For another hour I sat on my balcony watching the sky, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into my bones. I'd destroyed a company without breaking a single law. I'd proven my point in the most devastating way possible. I'd watched Preston lose everything he'd taken for granted. But I hadn't destroyed it. Not really. I'd just removed myself from an equation that couldn't function without me, and the equation had collapsed under its own weight. That wasn't sabotage. That was gravity. By Monday morning, the industry news was reporting that Preston Morrison and Sienna Blackwell had been terminated from Morrison Aviation, effective immediately. Gerald had reassumed temporary control from his hospital room in Newark, working with doctors and nurses hovering nearby, probably against every piece of medical advice he'd been given. Marcus sent me a text at noon. They're following your protocol. IT team is rebuilding the authentication node. Should be done by Wednesday morning. Gerald fired Preston this morning. Apparently it got ugly. Preston threatened to sue for wrongful termination. Sienna deleted all her social media accounts after someone found her kombucha disaster and it went viral. You saved 300 jobs without even being here, Cass. You're a legend. I stared at the text for a long time. I didn't feel like a legend. I felt tired. Hollow. Like I'd won a battle I never wanted to fight in the first place. By Tuesday I had 11 job offers sitting in my inbox. 6 from competing airlines who'd watched Morrison's meltdown and realized the value of someone who actually understood operations instead of just talking about disruption and innovation. 1 from a logistics consulting firm offering me twice what Gerald had paid. They wanted me to audit their systems and train their teams. One from an aviation technology startup that wanted me to build routing software from scratch. And one from Marcus himself. When this is over and Gerald retires for real, he wants you back. CEO position. Full equity. Your terms. He means it, Cass. I read that message 3 times, imagining walking back into Morrison Aviation as the person in charge. Fixing everything Preston had broken. Building it back better than before. Taking Gerald's legacy and carrying it forward the way it deserved. But I couldn't. Because going back would mean admitting that none of this had taught them anything, that firing me had been a mistake they could just undo with enough money and apologies. I declined them all except one. Airlink Dynamics. Morrison's biggest competitor. The airline that had been quietly eating our market share for years, watching our mistakes and learning from them. They offered me vice president of route operations, complete autonomy over my department, a team of 12 people who actually knew what they were doing, and a salary that made my hands shake when I saw the number. It was more money in a month than I used to make in 6. I accepted the offer and started the following Monday. Wednesday morning I started my new job from my apartment, wearing pajamas and sitting at my kitchen table with actual sunlight streaming through the windows instead of the fluorescent hell of the server room. Aerolink Dynamics had sent everything by courier the day before. A high-end laptop that was probably worth more than my car. Login credentials in a sealed envelope. A welcome packet with benefits information that made Morrison's look like a joke. And a handwritten note from the CEO Richard Vance on company letterhead. Cassandra, we've watched you keep Morrison in the air for years. We know what you're worth. We're honored to have you on our team. Build what you need. Hire who you need. Just keep us flying. Richard. I logged into their systems at 8 a.m., coffee steaming beside me, and immediately saw the difference. Clean documentation. Actual documentation, not just tribal knowledge scattered across email threads and sticky notes. Proper version control on every piece of code. Backup authentication protocols with multiple redundancies. 3 different team members with admin access instead of a single point of failure. Automated testing. Disaster recovery plans that had actually been tested instead of just written and filed away. It was what Morrison should have been. What I'd begged Gerald to invest in for years while he nodded and said, next quarter. And then forgot because there was always something more urgent, some other fire to put out. I spent the first hour just exploring the architecture, mapping the systems in my head, understanding how everything connected. Then I opened a secure chat with my new team, 12 people scattered across 3 offices who I'd been introduced to via video call the previous week, and started asking questions. They were sharp. They knew their stuff. And more importantly, they respected expertise instead of feeling threatened by it. I worked for 4 hours straight, accomplishing more than I used to in 12-hour marathons at Morrison. No interruptions. No Sienna wandering in to ask if we could just use blockchain to make routing more intuitive. No emergency calls about problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place because someone had ignored basic maintenance protocols to save money. At noon, I took a break and made myself actual lunch. A sandwich with fresh ingredients instead of whatever I could grab from a vending machine. I sat back down at my kitchen table and pulled up the news on my laptop. Morrison Aviation was flying again. Barely. The headline read, Morrison Aviation resumes limited operations after week-long ground stop. They'd followed my protocol. The IT team had rebuilt the authentication architecture from my instructions. Planes were taking off and landing again. But the article went on to detail the damage. 18 major corporate contracts cancelled. Stock down 41%. Passenger confidence shattered. Industry analysts openly predicting bankruptcy within 6 months. I should have felt satisfaction. That I just felt tired. That afternoon, Preston gave a press conference and I watched it with the kind of morbid fascination you reserve for car crashes you can't look away from. He stood at a podium in what looked like Morrison's main conference room, flanked by lawyers in dark suits. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. His tie was crooked. His eyes were red-rimmed either from crying or not sleeping. His carefully styled hair hung limply across his forehead. He read from a prepared statement, his voice flat and lifeless. Morrison Aviation deeply regrets the operational disruptions of the past week. We take full responsibility for the technical failures that impacted our valued customers and their travel plans. We are implementing new protocols and safeguards to ensure this never happens again. We appreciate the patience and understanding of our passengers during this difficult time. A reporter shouted from the crowd before Preston could step away from the podium. Mr. Morrison, is it true the outage was caused by your decision to fire your operations lead? Preston flinched visibly. That was a personnel matter. We believed we were moving in a new direction with operational leadership, but we recognize now that we didn't fully understand the technical dependencies of our systems. So you're admitting you made a mistake? Another reporter pressed. We're admitting that we underestimated the complexity of our routing infrastructure, Preston said carefully, reading from notes his lawyers had clearly prepared. We're taking steps to ensure better knowledge transfer and documentation going forward. Where is Sienna Blackwell? A third reporter called out. The Director of Operational Excellence you appointed just 2 months ago? Preston's jaw tightened. Ms. Blackwell is no longer with the company. Her role has been eliminated. Did she resign or was she fired? No further comment on personnel matters, one of the lawyers interjected, stepping forward to end the press conference. The camera cut to a different location. Gerald Morrison in his hospital room in Newark, giving an interview from his bed. He had an oxygen tube in his nose, monitors beeping softly in the background. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, smaller somehow, diminished by illness and the weight of watching his life's work crumble. We made mistakes, Gerald said, his voice weak but clear, staring directly into the camera. I made mistakes. I left my company in the hands of someone who wasn't ready, who didn't understand what made us successful. We forgot that in aviation expertise isn't optional. You can't replace knowledge with enthusiasm. You can't streamline away the people who keep you in the air. And you can't treat your foundation like it's disposable just because it's not flashy. The interviewer leaned forward. Are you referring to Cassandra Hayes, your former operations lead? Gerald nodded slowly. Cassandra Hayes was the best person I ever hired. She built the systems that made this company work. And my son fired her because she didn't fit his vision of what modern leadership should look like. He paused, breathing heavy. That was the biggest mistake in Morrison Aviation's history. And I take responsibility for putting him in a position where he could make that mistake. I raised my coffee mug to the TV screen. Damn right, Gerald. But saying it out loud didn't make me feel better. My new team at Aerolink was everything Morrison's should have been. They were smart, experienced, collaborative. 12 people who'd worked their way up through dispatch and logistics instead of watching a few TED Talks and declaring themselves experts. They asked intelligent questions. They implemented my suggestions without ego getting in the way. They challenged me when they thought I was wrong, but they did it respectfully, with data and reasoning instead of just dismissing expertise they didn't understand. For the first time in a decade, I left work at 5 p.m. Actually stopped working. Closed my laptop. Turned off notifications. I took weekends off. Real weekends where I didn't check email or monitor flight schedules or worry about weather systems forming over the Rockies. I went on a date with a guy I met at a coffee shop near my apartment. His name was David. He was a software engineer at a startup, early 40s, divorced, no kids. He actually understood what I did for a living. When I told him about routing algorithms and authentication protocols, his eyes lit up instead of glazing over. We saw a movie. Some thriller I barely paid attention to because I kept thinking about the fact that I was on a date in a movie theater like a normal person instead of sitting in a server room at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. Afterwards, we had dinner at an Italian place. We talked about books and travel and favorite restaurants. Normal things. Things that had nothing to do with planes or operations or systems collapsing. You seem different than I expected, David said over tiramisu we were sharing. Different how? I don't know. Lighter maybe? Like you're actually here instead of thinking about 10 other things. I smiled. That's because for the first time in 10 years, I'm not responsible for keeping planes in the air during my personal time. It felt surreal. Like I was playing at being a regular person after years of being a machine, a tool, a single point of failure in a system that had consumed everything I was. I started going to the gym. Bought a membership, went 3 times a week, remembered what it felt like to be in my body instead of just a brain attached to a keyboard. I bought plants for my apartment. Real ones that needed actual care. Watering schedules, sunlight requirements, the kind of responsibility that wasn't life or death but still mattered. I called my sister in California. We hadn't talked in over a year except for perfunctory text messages on birthdays. Cass. She sounded shocked when she answered. Is everything okay? Yeah, I said, realizing how sad it was that she assumed something must be wrong for me to call. I just wanted to talk. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours talking about nothing important. Her kids, her job, her husband's new obsession with sourdough bread. When I told her I'd quit Morrison, she started crying. I was so worried about you, she said, her voice thick. The last few times we talked you sounded like a ghost. Like you were disappearing into that job and there was nothing left of you except work. I hadn't realized how visible it had been. How much I'd lost of myself. Within a month, 3 other regional carriers reached out to me about consulting contracts. Word had spread through the industry about what happened at Morrison. And instead of seeing me as a saboteur, which I'd half expected, half feared, they saw me as a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't value expertise. I turned down most of the offers, but I did accept one invitation that surprised me. An aviation operations conference in Chicago wanted me to give a keynote speech about systems architecture and institutional knowledge. I stood on that stage in front of hundreds of operations managers and airline executives, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to skeptical to openly admiring. Your systems are only as strong as the people who understand them, I said, my voice carrying across the conference hall. Your efficiency is only as real as the expertise behind it. And if you think you can replace institutional knowledge with an app, a dashboard, or someone's girlfriend who watched a few YouTube videos, you're not optimizing. You're setting a timer on a bomb you don't know how to defuse. The applause was deafening. Afterwards, executives lined up to hand me business cards, asking if I'd consult for them, audit their systems, train their teams. I was becoming something I'd never expected. Not just an operations manager, but a voice for everyone who'd ever been dismissed, undervalued, treated like they were replaceable when they were actually irreplaceable. Felt strange. Felt powerful. It felt like vindication. Morrison Aviation declared bankruptcy exactly 6 months after I walked out of that conference room. I was sitting in my new office at Aerolink, an actual office with windows and a door that closed, not a cramped server room that smelled like burnt electronics, when Marcus called. His name flashed on my phone screen. I picked up on the second ring. It's over, Cass. His voice was heavy, flat with resignation. Gerald tried everything. Sold routes. Liquidated assets. Begged investors. But the damage was too deep. Chapter 11 filing went through this morning. I set down the report I'd been reviewing and stared out the window at the tarmac below, where Aerolink planes taxied in perfect choreographed precision. What happens now? Aerolink is buying what's left, Marcus said. Your company, actually. They're keeping some routes, absorbing some aircraft, cherry-picking the profitable pieces. But most of the corporate structure is gone. HR, finance, executive team, all gone. I felt a strange numbness, like watching a building you used to live in burn down from a safe distance. You know you should feel something, grief, satisfaction, vindication, but all you feel is detached observation. What about the employees? I asked. The 300 jobs? Aerolink is keeping about 60% of operations staff, pilots and crew. They want people who actually know how to do the work. Marcus paused. The rest get severance packages and unemployment. It's not nothing, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough when you'd built your life around a job that suddenly disappeared. Preston's already gone, Marcus continued. Took a job at his father-in-law's real estate company in Connecticut. Apparently he's starting at the bottom, actually learning the business this time. Sienna started a podcast about workplace toxicity and overcoming professional trauma, but it only lasted 4 episodes before she gave up. Not enough sponsors, I guess. I almost laughed at that. Almost. And Gerald. Marcus's voice broke. Gerald's in hospice, Cass. The stress, the stroke, the bankruptcy, it was too much. His heart's failing. Doctors say he's got days, maybe a week. The numbness cracked. Just a little. Just enough to let something sharp and painful through. Which hospice? I heard myself ask. Marcus gave me the address. I wrote it down on a sticky note, my handwriting shaky. After we hung up, I sat in my office for 20 minutes, staring at that address, trying to decide what I owed Gerald Morrison. What I owed the man who'd believed in me and then failed to protect me. The man who'd built something beautiful and then handed it to someone who destroyed it. I drove to the hospice center in Newark on a cold November afternoon, not entirely sure why I was going but unable to stay away. The building was nicer than I expected. Modern with large windows and a small garden visible from the parking lot. The kind of place you go to die with dignity instead of just die. I checked in at the front desk. The receptionist gave me a visitor badge and directions to Gerald's room. Second floor, East Wing, room 247. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, delaying the inevitable. Gerald was in a private room overlooking the garden. The afternoon light filtered through sheer curtains, casting everything in soft gold. He was hooked up to monitors that beeped softly, an oxygen tube in his nose and 4 in his arm. He looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that made my throat tight. His eyes were closed when I walked in. I thought maybe he was sleeping, thought maybe I could just leave without him knowing I'd been there. But then he stirred, his eyes opening slowly, focusing on me with effort. "Cassandra," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd come." I pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down. I wasn't sure I would either. We sat in silence for a moment. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear a nurse talking to another patient, her voice gentle and practiced. "I'm sorry," Gerald finally said. "For all of it." I looked at him, at the tears already forming in his eyes. "Gerald. No, let me say this." He coughed, wincing. "I'm sorry for Preston. For not protecting you. For building something I loved more than I loved being a father." He paused, struggling for breath. If I'd raised him right, if I'd taught him what mattered instead of just giving him everything he wanted, maybe none of this would have happened. The tears were running down his weathered face now, disappearing into the oxygen tube. "You built something beautiful," I said quietly. "Preston broke it. That's on him, not you." Gerald shook his head slightly. "I handed him the tools to break it. I gave him power he wasn't ready for. I chose family over competence because I thought blood meant something more than it does." He looked at me with eyes that held decades of regret. "You were the daughter I should have raised, Cass. Emily would have been like you, smart, tough, irreplaceable. I'm proud of you, kid. And I'm sorry I didn't say it enough when it mattered." I reached out and took his hand. It was cold, the skin paper thin. I could feel his pulse, weak and irregular. "You said it enough," I told him, even though I wasn't sure it was true. We sat like that for another hour. Sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. He told me about building the company, about flying the Cessna in the early days when every flight was a gamble. He told me about Emily, about the plans he'd had for her, the future she should have had. I told him about AeroLink, about my new team, about feeling like a person again instead of just a function. When I finally stood to leave, Gerald squeezed my hand one last time. "You're going to do great things, Cass," he said. "Greater than anything I ever built. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't let it consume you the way it consumed me. Don't sacrifice everything for work. Find something else. Someone else. Have a life outside the planes." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Gerald Morrison died 3 days later, quietly in the middle of the night. Marcus called me at 6 in the morning. I was already awake, drinking coffee on my balcony, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "He's gone, Cass," Marcus said simply. "Nurses said he went peacefully in his sleep. No pain." I hung up the phone and sat there on my balcony, staring at the sky, waiting to feel something. Grief, sadness, closure. Anything. But I felt nothing. Just empty. The tears came later, in the shower, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside me. I cried until the water ran cold, until there was nothing left. I wasn't crying for the company or the revenge or any of it. I was crying for the old man who'd seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. Who'd trusted me when trust was the most valuable thing he had to give. Who'd built something beautiful and watched it die because he'd made one terrible decision about who to trust with his legacy. The funeral was small. Marcus was there, standing beside me in a suit that didn't quite fit. A few old pilots who'd flown with Gerald in the early days. Some family members I didn't know. Cousins and nephews who'd probably shown up hoping there was money left to inherit. Preston stood on the other side of the funeral home, as far from me as possible. He wore an expensive black suit and sunglasses even though we were indoors. He didn't speak to me. Didn't even look at me. Just glared from across the room like I was the villain in his story. Like I was the one who'd destroyed everything instead of just walking away from his destruction. Sienna wasn't there. Probably for the best. I stood by Gerald's casket, closed, polished wood with brass handles, and said a silent goodbye to the man who'd taught me that expertise matters, that some things can't be replaced, that loyalty is a currency that should be spent carefully and never wasted on people who don't value it. I went back to work the Monday after the funeral because I didn't know what else to do. I sat in my office at AeroLink staring at my computer screen, trying to focus on route optimization reports and crew scheduling algorithms. But my mind kept drifting back to that conference room 6 months ago. To Preston's face when I told him he had 30 minutes. To the moment his smile died and he realized what he'd done. I'd won. I'd gotten my revenge. I'd proven my point. I'd watched Preston lose everything. His position, his girlfriend, his father's respect, his inheritance. Morrison Aviation was gone, dissolved into bankruptcy and sold for parts. And I had a better job, a better salary, a better life. But none of it felt the way I thought it would. Victory wasn't triumphant. It wasn't satisfying. It was just empty. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching planes take off in the distance, thinking about the 30-minute countdown that had destroyed everything. I'd wanted Preston to feel what I felt. The dismissal, the disrespect, the crushing weight of being treated like you're disposable. And he had felt it. He'd lost everything. But watching him lose it all hadn't healed anything inside me. It had just added more weight to an already heavy burden. Maybe that's what revenge really is. Not justice. Not closure. Just adding more broken pieces to an already broken world and pretending it makes you whole. 1 year after I walked out of Morrison Aviation, I stood in my new office at AeroLink Dynamics with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway and realized I barely recognized my own life. The office itself was a statement. Spacious, bright, with actual natural light instead of the fluorescent prison of the server room. A standing desk I actually used. Plants that were thriving instead of barely surviving. Photos on the wall. Me and David at a restaurant, me and my sister on a hiking trail, me receiving an industry award at the operations conference. I was vice president of route operations for the largest regional carrier in the Northeast. I had a team of 12 brilliant people who actually understood what they were doing, who challenged me respectfully and implemented ideas collaboratively instead of defensively. I made more money in a month than I used to make in 6 at Morrison. But more than the money or the title, I had something I'd forgotten was possible. A life outside of work. I took weekends off. Real weekends where I didn't think about routing algorithms or authentication protocols or whether a storm system over the Midwest was going to cascade into system-wide delays. I had hobbies. Photography. I'd bought a decent camera and started taking classes. Hiking. David and I had joined a group that did weekend trips to state parks. Cooking actual meals with fresh ingredients instead of microwaving whatever was fastest. David and I had been together for 8 months now. It was serious in a way I'd never allowed myself before. We just booked a vacation to Iceland for the spring. 10 days of exploring, disconnecting, actually being present instead of constantly monitoring my phone for emergencies. My sister had flown in from California the previous weekend to visit. We'd spent 2 days just being sisters. Brunch, shopping, talking about nothing and everything. Sitting in a cafe in Hoboken, she'd looked at me across the table with tears in her eyes. "You look different, Cass," she'd said. "Lighter somehow. Like you're actually living instead of just surviving." He was right. I was living. But sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep I still thought about that conference room. About Preston's face when I told him he had 30 minutes. About the exact moment he realized competence wasn't something you could fake. About Gerald in the hospice room, apologizing for failures that weren't entirely his to own. A letter arrived at my office in early December, forwarded from Morrison Aviation's bankruptcy lawyers. The envelope was hand-addressed, the handwriting neat but unpracticed, like someone who didn't write by hand very often. The return address was Stamford, Connecticut. Preston Morrison. I held it for a long moment, debating whether to just throw it away unopened. But curiosity won. Inside was a single page, handwritten on plain stationery. "Cassandra. I know I have no right to contact you and you have every right to ignore this or throw it away without reading. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did. Not just to you but to my father, to the company, to everyone who depended on us. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. I thought I could fake expertise because I'd never had to earn anything in my life. Everything was handed to me. Money, opportunities, second chances. I never learned what it meant to actually build something or to respect the people who do the building. You tried to warn me. Multiple times. With data and reports and explanations. And I dismissed you every single time because admitting you were right would have meant admitting I was wrong, and I'd never had to admit I was wrong before. I'm working in real estate now at my father-in-law's company. Starting at the very bottom. Cold calling clients. Showing apartments to people who can barely afford them. Learning the business from the ground up instead of pretending I already understand it because I watched a few videos or read a few articles. It's humbling. It's hard. It's probably what I should have done 20 years ago instead of drifting around Asia pretending I was finding myself. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even think I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that you were right about everything and I was wrong about everything, and I'm sorry. Preston. I read the letter 3 times looking for sarcasm or hidden manipulation, some angle he was working. But I couldn't find it. It seemed genuine, the words of someone who'd been broken down and rebuilt into something slightly more self-aware. I folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer, next to the stress ball shaped like an airplane that Gerald had given me years ago. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know if I should respond or just let it sit there as a record that he'd tried. In the end, I never responded to Preston's letter. Not because I was still angry. The anger had faded months ago, replaced by something quieter and more resigned. Not because I didn't believe his apology was genuine. I actually thought it probably was. I didn't respond because I realized that closure doesn't always come from the other person's apology or acknowledgement. Sometimes it comes from deciding you don't need anything from them anymore. I had built a new life on the ashes of the old one. A better life. A life where I was valued, where my expertise mattered, where I had boundaries and hobbies and relationships that weren't just transactional. I had learned the lessons I needed to learn. That competence is expensive and rare and should be valued. That the people who keep the lights on deserve respect and protection. That loyalty is a currency that should never be wasted on people who treat you as disposable. But I'd also learned something else, something harder and more complicated. Revenge doesn't heal you. It doesn't make you whole. It just proves a point, and points are cold comfort when you're alone with your thoughts at 3 a.m. What healed me wasn't watching Preston lose everything. It was building something new. It was the team at Aerolink who treated me like a person instead of a resource. It was the weekends with David where we talked about books and travel instead of flight schedules. It was the phone calls with my sister where we laughed about childhood memories. It was the quiet pride of knowing I'd walked away from toxicity instead of letting it consume me. It was choosing to be more than the sum of my anger. On the anniversary of Gerald's death, I drove to the cemetery alone. It was a cold December afternoon, the kind where the sky is gray and heavy with the promise of snow that hasn't fallen yet. I brought flowers, nothing fancy, just daisies from a grocery store, and walked across the frozen ground to Gerald's headstone. Gerald James Morrison. 1951 to 2024. Founder, father, pilot. I stood there for a long time, the flowers in my hand, trying to find the right words. You were right about a lot of things, Gerald, I finally said out loud, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. You built something that mattered. Something that employed people and connected communities and kept the economy moving. You trusted the wrong person to protect it, but that doesn't erase what you created. I placed the flowers at the base of the headstone. I carry that with me now. The belief that expertise is valuable. That some people really are irreplaceable, not because they're special, but because they've invested years into understanding things that can't be learned overnight. That foundations matter more than facades. A plane flew overhead low enough that I could see the airline markings. Like one of mine. I hope wherever you are, you know that the lessons survived even though the company didn't. And I hope you know that I forgave you a long time ago. You weren't perfect, but you tried. That's more than most people do. I drove away from the cemetery and headed toward the airport, watching planes take off and land in their careful choreography. Somewhere up there was a flight I'd helped route that morning. Crew assignments optimized, fuel calculations precise, weather patterns accounted for, everything working exactly as it should. I thought about all the invisible hands that made that flight possible. The dispatchers monitoring weather. The mechanics performing pre-flight checks. The pilots running through procedures they'd done 1,000 times before. The operations teams coordinating across time zones and hub cities. We were all foundations. We were all irreplaceable in our own ways, even if the organizations we worked for sometimes forgot that. And maybe that was the real lesson I'd learned from everything that happened. You can fire the pilot, but you can't fly the plane with enthusiasm and good intentions and motivational quotes. Expertise isn't optional. It's not something you can fake or delegate or replace with someone who looks better in meetings but doesn't understand the systems they're managing. And when organizations forget that, when they treat their foundations like disposable parts, like problems to optimize away, they don't just lose an employee. They lose the heartbeat. They lose everything. I pulled onto the highway heading home, the afternoon sun breaking through the clouds and painting everything in shades of gold. Behind me, Morrison Aviation was gone, dissolved into bankruptcy and memory. Ahead of me, the road stretched open and clear. I had a dinner reservation with David at 7. A team meeting tomorrow morning where we'd discuss expansion into 2 new hub cities. A photography class on Thursday. A phone call scheduled with my sister this weekend. A life. An actual life instead of just an existence built around preventing catastrophes. And for the first time in more than a decade, I wasn't looking back. I was flying forward, steady and sure, toward a horizon that was finally my own. If this story of calculated justice had you hooked from the 30-minute countdown, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Cassandra placed that ID badge on the table and calmly told Preston he had 30 minutes before the fleet stopped flying. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of revenge and resilience like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.